So, first of all, I want to say I am so proud of you. You know, I've worked with you for 26 years. This is a real honour for me to be here to say how proud I am of you. You know, when you were made Sir David Adjaye, it was like, whoa. I was like, okay, do I have to call him Sir now? And then this, it's like, wow, we are so proud of you. I met David in 1992. He was my tutor at South Bank University. I begged him to let me in his unit in my second year. He said, no, you have to wait till you're in your last year. I need you for my last year. And, you know, I didn't know that much about architecture at that point, but David took me on my first trip across Europe. Oh my goodness. We drove through the night to see an architectural masterpiece. We walked for miles and miles and miles. I had blisters every day. I had no heels, had to wear flat shoes. And we would climb fences just to get a peek through a building. And I was like, wow, this man is so determined, so passionate. It was just unbelievable. I needed to work with him. So I did, and I'm still here. You know, you're incredible. What you do is amazing. You inspire us every single day. When I look back, it's like, wow, you've really developed and changed over the years, and every day you inspire us. So we just, you know, we're so grateful for that. So enough about us. Let's move on to the projects. So, you know, I'm here in Ghana's capital, amazing place, Accra. I absolutely love it. On my way here, I just drove past the Cathedral site. You know, it's amazing to see it on site, absolutely amazing. And, you know, what I would like to ask is how did you feel, you know, not many people get to design a cathedral. You know, I've heard you talk a lot about the religious spaces and the community spaces and how the two are really important. So it'd be good to hear about how you felt and what those spaces mean.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you for your words earlier as well. It just really touched me, and you took me back to 1992 with your words, so thank you. The cathedral is when I was asked by His Excellency, the President of Ghana, I was completely taken aback. I was silenced by him because as an architect, we look at cathedrals and churches in our time now, and we don't think that that's about us. We think that that's about, you know, the past and the time that's been made. But then there was this moment of realizing that Ghana is a nation that's forming its identity and coming into its element all these years after independence in '57. So here we were at this moment where things like this could be imagined, and this incredible president was imagining that possibility and putting in place the elements for the nation that he wants to build. And I was just struck by the opportunity to meet him and for him to ask me to make a presentation to him. And it took me spinning, because, you know, in my career, I've always, you know, we've always talked about wanting to engage with new ideas, new topologies, new things. You know, as a young architect, I was like, what's evolving in the 21st century? What are we going to be doing? And then, it's like, a cathedral? That's not what I thought we were going to be doing. But then I realized that the cathedral now in the 21st century, for a nation that's developing in the 21st century, coming into its own in the 21st century, has its own set of challenges that are really profound for nation building, more than just a religious edifice, which it absolutely is. But it's also a symbol of a growing nation and its aspiration in the world. And it's about its soul, you know? And architecture, when it's great, speaks about the things that are very difficult to put language to sometimes, and very difficult to quantify beyond the function, you know? I think great architecture silences you to make you think about other things. And the opportunity to have that moment, to be able to even draw it. But I look in my sketchbook still, and I think, my goodness, I was drawing this, you know, 3 years ago. Is deeply humbling, deeply humbling. For me, you know, the cathedral in the 21st century is a place that brings all in the nation and all who visit, all the friends of the nation together. It's a space to create a new family, a new human family. And it's a space to speak about the things that, you know, in society, we talk about in a formal way, but I really think it's a space to speak of the spirit of humanity and our genuine inquiry into the spirit of humanity with our fellow humans, you know?
I mean, it's not the only religious building that you're working on. So I remember being in your office saying, David, what have we done right? You know, all these religious buildings, it's
Suddenly,
like,
though.
so, yeah, it's like, wow.
Yeah.
But the Abrahamic family house, obviously, which is a synagogue, mosque, and a church all on one site. And when I look at the project, I remember like many years ago when you were looking at pavilions, and they were spaces of respite, they were kind of, they have a relationship. Do you think there's any relationship between what you were doing in the early days to the spaces that we see? It's on site, you can see it coming out of the ground at the moment. Do you think there's a relationship?
No, for sure. The big sort of confession is that everything at the beginning was a rehearsal for this moment. In my mind's eye, architecture just doesn't have a space like an industrial designer for prototyping. We can't make 20 churches and see which one works and then discard them all and do one. So you've got to find a space in which you're using the opportunity of practice to investigate the issues that you want to make. And if you can see now that the temples of the Abrahamic family are really those early projects, but now really understood as things that can be in the world. You know, they were only 4 meters by 5 meters by 6 meters. Now they are 30 meters by 30 meters by, you know, 100 meters. So and the confidence that I've had doing those early projects has allowed me to now be really clear about what I want to do with these projects.
I mean, if you look at the Studio Museum in Harlem, for me, it's amazing because it's looking at a new typology, a way of allowing, you know, probably people that don't always go to those kind of spaces. So opening up, making it feel, you know, when you look at it, it's like a living room for the community. And it's a museum, so it opens up that typology for people that wouldn't normally go to those spaces. And, you know, that reminds me of some of our other projects, different typologies, but like the Ideas Store. And I remember meeting Thelma Golden at the London studio, and she talked a lot about how all of the spaces connected to each other, and the connectivity between all of the functions. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
No, the Studio Museum is such an important project for me, especially in terms of a cultural infrastructure in America, coming after the National Museum of African American History and Culture. The Studio Museum really is one of the kind of heroic organizations that were sort of born almost like a guerrilla activity to deal with the social injustice of the art world. And they, you know, they couldn't afford to be downtown or even in Chelsea, which was actually cheap then, but they couldn't even afford to do that. So they were upstairs in Harlem. You know, they couldn't even afford a shop front, and they just were determined to make spaces for artists, to create spaces for the community to engage, and to create an opportunity to show the artists that they were incubating to the public if the mainstream was going to ignore them. And, you know, this guerrilla activity kind of positioned them in a way to be outsiders who have now become absolutely the center, in my mind, in terms of when you look at what's going on in American art right now. The production of artists, if I can say that have come through the Studio Museum are some of the most celebrated names right now. Kerry James Marshall, Kehinde Wiley, all these characters that we now talk about, all have come through this sort of guerrilla operation, which has now put them right in the center. And in a way, the generosity of going to the widest community is the heart of the magic. And the building is trying to imagine that now for the museum typology. That it is, as you said, a living room for Harlem. And that room that you come into, which is both a stage, a sort of soaring inspirational space, a place to hang out, a place that dissolves with the street, is free. You know, there isn't somebody that's going to stop you. You can come into that foyer, you can hang out, you can be on the stoop. There'll be events happening in there. And then there's the art spaces that are above. But embedded with the art spaces are also studio spaces. They've not lost that program. Studios are up in the sort of upper levels of the building, but the public are encouraged to go up. It's part of the experience of seeing the art. You're seeing the art, you're also seeing artists working, you're looking at the workshops, and there is also a roof terrace that allows for events and sculpture to be also displayed. So it really, for me, is a vertical public space that is really about creativity. And COVID has sort of slowed it down a little bit, but it really is accelerating, and just excited for it to open.
If you look at the new museum here on the continent, the Edo Museum of West African Art, your work is wedded in research. You know, I've learned so much about so many different things through the amount of time you and the office put into researching the subject. And I hear when you talk about Smithsonian, some of the research came from Benin City, and now I see this museum. Is there a relationship? Did you learn something from the previous project that you're taking into the new one?
No, it's in the hindsight of time, you're probably looking at it, people would think that I've somehow made it, you know, there's a kind of link. But the provenance of the opportunity of making the Smithsonian project meant that I really looked very deeply into West African cultures, and specifically at the Benin culture, which was so influential. It made me understand, I knew, but I didn't know how deeply this influence was. So I really got to really immerse myself much more deeply in the ramifications and also the architecture of that time. So now, you know, full circle, finishing, in a way for me, the story is a little bit like the Smithsonian's actually the epilogue, the end, but we're now going backwards, one of those movies when they kind of go, oh yeah, and you see the scene, and then you reverse backwards, and then they start the scene again. And now the scene is almost as though the Edo Museum is the museum that actually allows you to understand what the reference is of the Smithsonian and why it's so important. These great cultures that had incredible artistic, cultural, scientific practice are some of the reasons why the sort of the way in which America was able to capitalize on that knowledge of the people that were carried to that world to build it, were able to do that. You know, those people were able to do what they did for America, because they were not just farmers; they were goldsmiths, intellectuals, bridge builders, architects of their time that were moved. So an incredible skill source was moved. And to understand that, the Edo Museum, I think, is about really contextualizing that moment. So in my mind, I've started to see them as sort of brother and sister, or twins, or sort of distant family, where, you know, one actually justifies the other and qualifies, right? Not justifies, but qualifies the other. In the project, we're trying to show that this museum and why it's happening in Edo and what we're trying to do with it is about really looking into the past in order to propel a future. Looking into a past, knowing a future that's already unfolding, but trying to set that in form so that people, generations that are going to be born after us, can actually look and see the story in the trajectory it should be sort of understood. You know,
I love that's goes throughout a lot of your work, or all of your work actually. Totally different typology. So we just finishing this year a tower, so 130 William Street. You know, it's our first tower. We've wanted it for a long time. And when I look back to when we first started working, we worked a lot on artist studios, residences. You know, we probably got to number 25 and you were like, Lucy, it's okay, because we're learning something every time. You know, we tested new materials. You know, some buildings or some residences we were almost testing facades inside the building, and so every one was kind of a testing pad. And do you think some of those ideas were brought into the tower?
I think the tower is a culmination of a lot of the thinking that's been happening over the 20-something odd years that now, 25 years in my mind, but
26 in mine.
26 in yours. A tower is an extraordinary piece of engineering and science, and there's a lot that is, given by the kind of dynamics of putting such a, ridiculous idea on a small piece of footprint, this incredibly tall thing. But what has been learnt over the years was this idea of how to create atmospheres and how to create qualities, through all the rehearsals of artist studios and the projects that we did that we were exhausted by. When it came to the tower and working within the small footprint, but carving as much atmosphere and a space that allows people to not feel claustrophobic and not feel trapped by the kind of banality of modern construction, which is drywall and, the things that we always fight about and talk about in our studio, that we want to create more than just what the construction is able to do. We want to create atmospheres that allow people to kind of imagine, a much more fulfilling life. You can see in the tower that we've made these moments, whether it's about water or about being in the sky or just being in your home and framing the city or having places for children, that there are just moments everywhere in all the kind of footprint that we were given, from the plaza that is going to be unveiled at the end, the sort of mezzanine terraces, etc., the roofs, those who might have the penthouses with the loggias that are outside. It's trying to make a rich experience in a very small footprint. And I think that has happened because we have learned to do as much as we can with very little from the beginning stages. The beginning stages of a practice is really critical. It's the test bed, and it's where you learn all your nimbleness and ability to react. So, I'm always laughing to myself because when we're looking at new projects, I'm always thinking now, oh yeah, I remember in 2004, that thing we did, or that material that we tested. It's like, that would be amazing now to scale it, to think about it as this kind of thing. So that is always also now in my mind, and I'm continually kind of going back in the archive and thinking about things that were important, but things that can be useful to thinking about the future that we're now working on.
A lot of your work originally, we looked at the quality of light in spaces, especially, in London, the typology of houses are very small and tight. So you're always kind of studying, how do I get more light into there? And I think when you look at the tower, it's just flooded with light, and but in a way that you can kind of view, you can get these frames to the vistas, and it really reminds me of a lot of the early work that we were doing. I guess the next typology is the libraries. I think we delivered Idea Store in Tower Hamlets, and you talked a lot about the library as kind of a living room for the 21st century. And last year, it was 10 years since it was built. I went back to see Idea Store, and it was amazing because it was full of this community, this diverse community, everyone speaking different languages, all from different places, watching a football match on the top floor. And I spoke to them, and they were saying, they don't have that space in their home, and this is like an extension to their house. And I was like, wow, we've really, a lot of people were afraid to cross the threshold to go into a library in those times. And it was not just about the books, but about, what it could give back to the community. And I see now we're doing the Winter Park Libraries in Florida, a different context, obviously in the middle of a landscape, very different to the market in which we built. But I wondered what we're giving back to the community there, and are you still exploring, what does this do? What does this give back? And how do people use the spaces?
No, the library is one of the, I was so happy that was the first public project that I ever did. So it was private houses, private studios, and then this public project about, knowledge for everyone.
I remember we dreamed about that for a long time. To move from the scale of just the small to the next.
Oh my God. We spoke
about it so much.
Yeah, it was, for me, just so fulfilling. But this idea of libraries for me in the sort of end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, was more than just a repository for books. The history of it is that libraries were made mostly post-war. There's academic and sort of monastic libraries, but those were about private, sort of exclusive training grounds for the elite. The idea of the democratized library really happened post-war, sort of the destruction of the world and the time to rebuild the world. And the library was seen as, getting the right amount of books to allow every sort of crack and sort of corner of the community to be able to get access to basic knowledge about how the world is constructed, what it means. And sort of we hit at the end of the 20th century, the internet changes that because we no longer need the Encyclopedia Britannica and all these things. We need it in a different way now. I think it's such a beautiful book to read, but it's more of a historical document. So what is the library now? The library at the beginning of the 20th century became, for me, the social space. It became the space where several generations had already experienced using the library as part of their everyday, as part of the extension of their public life. So why would we want to switch off something that had become a way in which the classes that are kind of mobily sort of coming up with mobility through society, why are we going to switch off access to knowledge centers that is part of the nourishment of any society because of the internet? So it felt to me that the internet was just another flourishment of this system, and that the library now had sort of evolved from just becoming this depository of books and hushed, haloed reading to being the space where a lot of learning and cross-pollination happens, a lot of rub between seeing different generations. We live in a society where we segregate our generations now, and places like the library are where you would see an old person reading or a young toddler doing something. It's not just in the shopping center. The library was one of the few places where multi-generational learning in, sort of by osmosis would happen. And so for me, this idea of encouraging that nourishment and bringing sort of lifelong learning, education, all these other facilities into it, and all the kind of workshops and outreach that we did was so important in Florida. So I'm deeply invested in this, and I really believe it. For me, that is religion. This idea of access to knowledge for all is my religion. But when you come out of the urban context and you're in somewhere like Florida, which is much more suburban, and this is in a park, what has been beautiful is that the city added an extra program of their event center. And the event center is a fantastic facility for this community who like to hold many things, but we've sort of really grown it. So it is something where small conferences can happen. In our renderings, we showed images of how a robotics class can, display kind of, new technologies, or, a wedding or bar mitzvah can happen, or, just a celebration of anything else. So that's happening as a cluster with traditional library services, and then outdoor learning spaces, outdoor spaces that connect to the water. So it's sort of moved for me from being a building to becoming a kind of campus. So in Florida, it's really a campus of public life. So you have the clusters of all the different things that you need, and they become a destination that young people and old people can go to and spend time. Because sometimes your home is just too small, or your home is not where you're fully comfortable, but you want a space in the public where you don't feel like you have to transact. That it's not just about selling, but it's just about being in nature, being in the world. It shouldn't just be the park, it should also be other infrastructure. And for me, the library is part of that infrastructure that we must build in our cities to edify our communities.
You spoke a lot, in our career about the pavilion in the park, and this reminds me of kind of a super pavilion in the park because they're large. But yeah, I think it's this really special project. One of my really favourite projects is one that you've just finished in Brixton, in Windrush Square. It's very small, but it means so much. And I think for Cherry Gross Memorial, for a woman who was shot by the Metropolitan Police in front of her children and paralysed and then died 35 years later, it must have been so emotional to design something that gave back. And I think this is really a beacon, not just for Brixton, but for the world. And I went to see it last week, and it really draws you're drawn to it. So if you could just talk a little bit about your vision and what you wanted to do with that pavilion. And
as you know, Lucy, I've been talking about monuments and memorials for a very long time, and the importance of continually making monuments and memorials in our cities. It shouldn't just be about things of history, but they should be about very important markers in our societies. And the horror of what happened to Cherry Gross, that she was shot and paralyzed, and really the quality of her life diminished, and then the loss of her and the impact on her family is something that really is something that was such a marker. I remember being a young child at that time in London. And this idea of making a monument, which is a very small thing, it's so small, but to add to the built environment that we're in, monuments that speak to us who are in the minority, to show that there is actually a space for all voices in the built environments that we all walk through, is so critical, because that is how you get the take-up. That's how you get people to feel a part of a place, and to feel that the place also values them and their histories and their narratives. So this little monument, which is loaded with lots of symbols about the Caribbean culture, about African culture, about British culture, it's a fusion of all these things. It really speaks about pavilions and landscapes. It speaks about Rastafarianism. It speaks about which something which I know Cherry, when I spoke to Lee, was very deeply sort of invested in, and the kind of ethics of it. West African culture, the importance of the triangle and kingship and symbolism and in architecture. And it's a fusion that creates an idea which speaks about this, this dialectic between all these worlds. And I hope that the monument is at once something that is not like a traditional English monument, but somehow is also in a way that it's there. So it's not about trying to be strange, it's trying to be something that shows that there's another quality to the references. That's very important, which is brought by the Caribbean community and the diverse communities who are in London, who are in Brixton specifically, and for their voices to be in that landscape. So I wanted it to be, to be strong, but to also be fragile. There's a kind of delicacy about it, I hope. And then I wanted it to feel like a shelter. And I wanted it to feel also like a home of an ancestor, that when you were there, you came to a place that you could sit and speak with this ancestor, and that their dedication is right there. There are flowers on top that hopefully will grow and sort of drape, but you're under this incredible abstract shelter that really is sort of slightly defying gravity, but creating a sort of moment for you to be in a world when, we know that square when, it's full, people are rushing everywhere, but somehow under this frame, this edicular sort of architecture that sort of creates, you become the character in the architecture. Any person that goes into it becomes fused into that narrative. So it's a sort of living memorial of the people of Brixton, and a living memorial of this incredible tragedy, which I think this structure just goes some way to creating a restorative justice sort of narrative in this incredible thing.
It absolutely does. When you go there, you stand under this kind of almost floating triangle, and you feel safe, but in the same way, kind of not. So it's kind of weird with this kind of column, which I think is to symbolise the strength of Cherry Gross, just like holding up this triangle.
She's holding it.
It kind of looks unreal because the cantilever is so big. So it's absolutely incredible. We could talk all day. I think what I'd like to say is, look, I'm so proud of you, but so is everyone in the Ghana office, the New York office, and the London office, and your family, and all of your clients. So,
thank you, Lucy.
So proud of you.
So great to have this talk with you. It means so much to me. Thank you.